Hello, and welcome to the National Drone Safety Awareness Week. Today's video is a guide to starting a public safety drone program. Before we get started, I want to give a special thanks to Ryan Marlowe at the State of Alaska Department of Transportation for making this possible today. My name is Mark Huelskoetter. I work for the FAA in the Law Enforcement Assistance Program. I'm one of the newest members of the team, but my background is in law enforcement. I recently retired from the Anchorage Police Department. Before retiring, I had the distinct honor of being able to establish their unmanned aerial system, aka drone program. I had a wonderful time doing it, and I'm here today to help share kind of the lessons learned. So today's video is meant to be a starting point. It's not necessarily a step-by-step guide on how to set up your program, and you can even apply some of the lessons in today's video for starting your program that may not necessarily even be public safety related. So let's get started. The best place to begin is understanding exactly what you wish to accomplish when you establish your program. I suggest writing out a concept of operations. The easiest way to tackle this is to answer these 6 questions. You don't exactly have to write it in this order, just write it out so that it makes sense to the person reading it. This is going to be a high-level overview of everything you intend to do with your program. Who? Define the roles of who all is going to be involved in the program. For example, who's going to administer and oversee the program? Who are your pilots going to be? Who's responsible for the maintenance? You just want to document the structure of your program. The what is what you're going to be using to implement your program. Is it a simple quadcopter with a camera so you can document photos at a collision scene? Or do you have some more complex ideas in mind? When? You're going to define when you're going to use your aircraft and put some reasonable limits on the scope of its use. Where? So where do you need to operate? Is it someplace more rural that's not controlled airspace, or is it more like Anchorage, which has a significant amount of controlled airspace with one of the busiest international airports, the largest seaplane base, a busy general aviation airport with a significant military presence? You just need to have a grasp on what's in your area. And the how. How do you propose to do this safely? What type of qualifications are you going to require for your flight crew? Are there any other safety considerations? And then why? This is your explanation as to why having a drone program is a good thing. Does it save money or labor? Does it increase safety? As long as you can answer all these questions in a short, understandable document, you're well on your way to starting your program. Let's talk a little bit about developing your policy for your new drone program. So first off, I'm not a lawyer, so please involve your agency's counsel in this process. But we're going to start with a review of an applicable law. Since we're in the state of Alaska, let's look at the Alaska law specifically governing the use of UAS by law enforcement, which is in Alaska Statute 1865-901. It defines essentially what you must do to administer your program if you're in law enforcement. I don't want to bore you entirely, but kind of let's break this law down as it's written so we understand it. First part, A law enforcement agency shall adopt procedures for the use of unmanned aircraft systems. The procedures adopted under this section must require at a minimum that the law enforcement agency, 1, obtain any authorization, permit, or certificate required by the Federal Aviation Administration to operate the unmanned aircraft system. Easy. We're going to cover that here a little bit later today when we talk about Part 107 and we talk about public aircraft operations. 2, allow the unmanned aircraft system to be operated only by unmanned aircraft system pilots and crew members who have been trained and certified in the operation of the unmanned aircraft system and only under the supervision of the officials trained in the policies and procedures governing the use of the unmanned aircraft system. So breaking that down, they essentially want trained air crews, and they want to have somebody responsible for the oversight of the program. And 3, provide that the flight of an unmanned aircraft system be approved by the Commissioner or Deputy Commissioner of the Public Safety or the Chief Administrative Officer of the law enforcement agency or the officer's designee. Essentially, they want to make sure that the head of the agency has blessed off on your program. All right, we'll continue a little bit further down here. Number 4, ensure that the flight of an unmanned aircraft system be for a public purpose. That's kind of self-explanatory. They don't want people flying around harassing wildlife or doing silly things with a UAS they shouldn't be doing. And they're going to hold you to it because it's now codified into law. Number 5, maintain a record of each flight, including the date, time, and purpose of the flight, and the identity of the authorizing official. All right, so this goes to the accountability of your program. This is what we talked about with who all is involved in your program. You need to have somebody that you can report to that is accountable for all the flights. Number 6 is establish an auditable flight record system, including the documentation of a change in the flight time record. Again, this goes to the accountability. Again, we want to make sure that your program is accounting for all the uses of your aircraft. Number 7, this is primarily for law enforcement, but it's a good idea for public safety as well, is establish some sort of method for notifying the public of the operation of a UAS, unless notifying the public would endanger the safety of a person. So they gave law enforcement a bit of an out there. If you're going to be serving a search warrant and you need to get the drone overhead before, you don't have to notify people that you're going to be flying. But it's always a good idea to notify the public just to keep any potential operations out of your way. And number 8, provide for community involvement in the development of the policies required in this section, including consideration of public comment. And we're going to get to that here a little bit later when I talk about community engagement. It's always a good idea. All right, the next section of law, 1865-902. This is when a law enforcement agency can use an unmanned aircraft system. So number 1, to gather evidence in a criminal investigation under the terms of a search warrant, or B, in accordance with a judicially recognized exception to the warrant requirement, or in situations not involving a criminal investigation not intended to lead to the production of evidence for use in a criminal investigation, if it doesn't constitute an unwarranted invasion of personal privacy and is consistent with procedures set forth in the previous section. So what they're telling us is they want us to use a drone in law enforcement mainly for criminal investigation, but if you have a flight that is public safety related, you can still use it for that. All right, so a good example of that is November 30th, 2018, 7.1 earthquake. We used the drone to go take images of bridges and the port, and that was definitely very much a public safety need. And so we're covered under the law to be able to do that. There's also in 902 here, they talk about under A law enforcement agency must not retain images captured by an unmanned aircraft system unless the retention of the image is required as part of the investigation or prosecution, for training, or by some other federal or state ordinance. So essentially, you need to think about that when you're setting your program up, what you're going to do with the data that you produce. If you're a law enforcement agency, let's talk specifically about some considerations. We had a recent court decision here in Alaska in our appellate courts. It was McKelvey v. State of Alaska, dated September 4th, 2020. It's captioned in Department of Public Safety Legal Bulletin 387. Essentially, in this case, the court found that absent an applicable exception to the search warrant requirement, police must obtain a search warrant before engaging in aerial surveillance with use of a telephoto lens. Now, I know nowhere in there does it say UAS, and this case is not involving UAS. It is involving a 172, and a police officer with a telephoto lens is taking photos in somebody's backyard. But if you apply that same reasoning that the court did to a UAS, you're going to find very quickly that here in Alaska, they're going to require you to have a search warrant if you're going to try to look in some place that you couldn't normally see. So our courts have consistently held that the Alaska Constitution affords its citizens more individual rights than the United States Constitution. So keep that in mind. When you start flying over people's property, you need to very much respect their privacy. Once you have a draft of your policy together, get it out to the public and engage with your community. Take the feedback and criticism to heart. You're always going to have those naysayers out there who are against your program no matter what, but I think you'll find that the overwhelming majority of our citizens are going to be very supportive. Emphasize that your program's policy respects privacy and demonstrate that your policy holds people accountable. Also take the time to educate the public a little bit about airspace and the fact that it's a public space and that your UAS is an aircraft, just like an airplane, as defined by law. An aircraft is any device used or intended to be used for the purposes of flight. Let's talk a little bit about the ways that you can operate your program. You have two choices, essentially. You can operate as a public aircraft, or you can operate under Part 107 rules. The next couple of slides are going to be talking about the benefits of each and how to go about it. So how do you choose which one to operate under? Well, you're going to start with the use case in mind. What do you want your UAS to do for you? And that's going to determine what can be approved. So you're going to need to learn about the legal frameworks available. First being a public operator operating under a certificate of authorization. The other is the civil operator underneath Part 107. You have to fully comply with the applicable flight rules under each circumstance, and you cannot combine the two and choose the best of both. You have to operate under one set of rules. In order to operate as a public aircraft, you need to understand what it means to be a public aircraft. So we're going to review some of the statutes and legal interpretations. As I said previously, I'm not a lawyer, but I encourage you to read and understand the rule. In basic terms, applicable to what we're talking about today, is a public aircraft under the regulations is an aircraft owned and operated by the government of a state, the District of Columbia, or a territory or a possession of the United States, or a political subdivision of one of these governments. So for example, Anchorage is a political subdivision of the state of Alaska, which is in the United States. Mission must also qualify as being a public status. So it has to be for a governmental function. So the term governmental function means an activity undertaken by a government such as national defense, intelligence missions, firefighting, search and rescue, law enforcement, including transport of prisoners and detainees, aeronautical research, or biological or geological resource management. Unless your mission fits one of those, it's not a public aircraft operation. A certificate of authorization as a public aircraft will cover much of what you want to do with your program. But what about the examples where you want to demonstrate your drone program to a school with a STEM program, or maybe the media wants to take a look at it, so you're going to fly a demonstration flight? Well, that's actually not a governmental function, so it wouldn't qualify as a public operation. Once you've determined you're going to become a public aircraft operator, you need to do a few things. You need to obtain a public declaration letter from your city or your state that essentially declares your agency a public agency. You're going to send the copy of that letter to the FAA, both by email and by regular mail. Next, you're going to obtain a user ID and password for the COA application processing system, aka CAPS, from the FAA. Once you get your credentials to do that, you can fill out an application for your COA. All right, so let's talk about certificates of authorization for public aircraft. There's three basic types of COAs available. The first one is a blanket area COA. It allows for operations in Class G airspace. Now, this presentation isn't about airspace, but let's just say this is uncontrolled airspace. I encourage you to find out about the airspace in the area you plan to operate. It does allow for night operations, which is something you can't do with the Part 107 unless you've received a waiver for night operations. And it's very easy to obtain this authorization. The next one is a jurisdictional COA. This one takes longer for approval due to coordination between flight standards and the air traffic control. It provides for operations in controlled airspace. Essentially, the operator is provided a map which has a grid which displays the maximum allowed altitude for the operations within that airspace. If you need to operate in a section of the grid that is marked 0, or you need to operate higher than what is currently listed in that grid, you then have to apply for the third certificate of authorization, which is the special government interest or emergency COA. So it requires that you already have a COA in place, and it will enable operations outside of your already approved COA if there's a temporary flight restriction. And approval process is actually very speedy. The slide here says within 60 minutes. In personal experience, it's more like 5 to 10 minutes. So which one is best? We'll take a look at both the options and see what they offer. So under Part 91, operating with a certificate of authorization, you're allowed to fly at night. You can operate over people in certain life safety emergencies. There currently is no beyond visual line of sight, although there's a caveat to that, and I'll get to that in a moment. The responsibility shifts from the federal government down to the city, state, or local government that has the program. That program gets to self-certify their pilots, the aircraft, and the control stations. You're required to file a NOTAM before each flight. You have to file a monthly report with the FAA for the COA, and it's only for qualified missions, those being the missions we talked about previously with the government purpose. Under Part 107, you need to obtain a waiver before you fly at night. There is currently no beyond visual line of sight without a waiver. There's no operations over people without an additional waiver. Every pilot has to have a Part 107 remote pilot certificate. Your UAS has to be under 55 pounds. You can operate in controlled airspace if you file paperwork with the FAA drone zone or with an application that has the low altitude authorization and notification, aka LANC capability with it. And basically, you have the most flexibility when it comes to missions. Now, as far as beyond visual line of sight goes, there is a very new program available. It's the Tactical Beyond Visual Line of Sight, and it's open to current COA holders. You can apply for the Tactical Beyond Visual Line of Sight. Okay, let's talk about emergency operations. If you're flying under Part 107 or a COA, but you need some additional operational provisions, or there's a temporary flight restriction where you need to operate, or you have a need to fly in controlled airspace, you do have options available. If any of these boxes were checked for you, you can get a hold of the FAA System Operations Support Center, aka the SOSC, by calling their number 202-267-8276. And this is where they will get you that special government interest COA. They get back to you very quickly. Like I said, in my own experience, it was like 5 to 10 minutes, although it can take up to an hour. All right, so no matter which one you choose, at the end of the day, it's still the pilot's responsibility for the aircraft. So underneath the public aircraft rule, the way it's written, the responsibility and the authority of the pilot in command is the pilot in command of an aircraft is directly responsible for and is the final authority as to the operation of that aircraft. When you look at Part 107, it reads very much the same. So the remote pilot command, first off, you have to designate who the remote pilot in command is before you fly the aircraft. There can be more than one pilot available, but there's only one pilot in command. That remote pilot in command is directly responsible for and is the final authority as to the operation of the small unmanned aircraft system. So additionally, the remote pilot in command must ensure that the small unmanned aircraft will pose no undue hazard to other people, other aircraft, or other property in the event of a loss of control of the aircraft for any reason. The remote pilot in command must ensure that the small UAS operation complies with all applicable regulations of the chapter, and the remote pilot in command must have the ability to direct the small unmanned aircraft to ensure compliance with the applicable provisions of the chapter. There are lots of resources available to you guys out there. A good one is the Before You Fly app. You can get it on iOS and Android. It's very handy. You open up the app, it knows where you're at based on the GPS on your phone, and it'll essentially tell you if you are good to fly or not. And if not, it'll tell you why not. For information about obtaining Part 107 waivers, go visit the FAA Drone Zone webpage. The link is on the screen here. And if you need to file a NOTAM as a certificate of authorization holder, one of the easiest ways to do it is to get an account with www.1800WXBrief. There you can input your your NOTAM, and you can see what other UA operating areas there are out there. When it comes to regulations, I highly encourage you to take a look at the 4 regulations mentioned in the slide. The ACE, the Air Advisory Circular regarding public aircraft operations. Read and understand Part 107 of 14 CFR that talks about everything small unmanned aircraft systems wise. Again, the Advisory Circular 107-2 and small unmanned aircraft systems will essentially give you everything you need to understand how this all works. And then under 49 USC, you can look at those sections there to talk about public aircraft and public aircraft operations. For general information, please visit the FAA's webpage, the faa.gov/UAS. And for emergency operations, you can always get a hold of the SOSC at 202-267-8276. All right, we're at the end of my presentation. I'm sorry I bored you to death. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, feel free, get a hold of uashelp@faa.gov, or you can call them at toll-free 844-FLY-MY-UA. That's 844-359-6982. If you have any questions about what the Law Enforcement Assistance Program can do for your agency, you can email leap@faa.gov, or you can certainly, if you can type my email address down fast enough, email me directly and I'd be happy to answer your questions. Again, thank you very much to Ryan and the Alaska DOT. I really appreciate your time, and thanks for watching.